My wife looked me in the eye and told me our sons weren't mine before vanishing with them for 5 years. "You're just a stranger with a paycheck, Ethan," she spat as she walked out. I had no evidence to stop her. Half a decade later, the phone rang with a death sentence. My son Noah was dying of bone marrow failure. Vanessa wasn't a match, and she was desperate. I didn't care about the past. I went to that hospital to save my boy. But when the genetic specialist ran the compatibility profile, he didn't just ask for a retest. He locked the door and called in the chief of surgery. They stared at my charts like they were seeing a ghost. What the doctor whispered to me next didn't just save my son's life. It proved that the woman I'd called my wife was the real stranger all along. I'm truly grateful you've joined me today. Your presence here means everything as we walk through these stories together. Please remember, while this narrative contains fictionalized elements for our journey today, the lessons on resilience and truth are very real. I'd love to know who is listening. Where are you tuning in from? Drop your city or country in the comments. It's how we turn this channel into a community. The call that changed my life didn't come with a warning. It was 3:14 a.m. on a rain-slicked Monday in November. I remember the smell of stale coffee and the hum of my plotter. I'd been buried in the structural integrity reports for the Riverside Bridge project for 12 hours straight. Stress testing steel was the only thing that kept me from stress testing my own mind, from thinking about Noah and Liam and the 5 years of birthdays I'd missed. When my phone vibrated against the mahogany desk, displaying a restricted hospital ID, my heart didn't just race. It stopped. I almost let it go to voicemail. The sound of a gavel isn't just a noise, it's the sound of a foundation cracking. To a structural engineer, every building has a breaking point, a load it simply cannot bear. For me, that limit was reached in a sterile, wood-paneled courtroom 3 days before my 31st birthday. I sat there in my best suit, my hands steady only because I was gripping the edge of the mahogany table until my knuckles turned white. Vanessa sat across from me, looking every bit the victim she had spent months auditioning to be. She didn't look at me. She looked at the judge with wide, watery eyes that I once thought were the most honest things in the world. When the judge asked for the final evidence regarding custody, Vanessa didn't shout. She didn't scream. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a manila envelope with the practiced grace of someone performing a magic trick. "I didn't want it to come to this, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough for the court reporter to catch the heartbreak. "But I can't let a stranger raise them. Not when they aren't yours." She slid the DNA results across the table. I remember the smell of the paper, crisp, chemical, and cold. I looked at the percentages, the bolded 0% next to my name, and the world simply stopped spinning. I knew the math was wrong. I had been there for every midnight feeding, every fever, every scraped knee. I had felt the twins' heartbeat against my chest before they could even walk. But the paper didn't care about my memories. The paper said I was a biological error. "You're a good man, Ethan," she said later that afternoon, cornering me in the hallway as the bailiffs cleared the room. There was no trace of the trembling victim now. Her eyes were sharp, metallic. "But you're a provider, not a father. My sons deserve a legacy, not just a paycheck from a man who spends more time with blueprints than people." She had planned it with the precision of a demolition. She knew my pride wouldn't let me fight a truth backed by science. She knew I was too logical to argue with data. She took the boys that night. I stood in the driveway of our suburban home, watching the red taillights of her SUV fade into the rain, taking Noah and Liam with her. I went back inside to a house that was suddenly too quiet, surrounded by half-finished Lego towers and the lingering scent of baby powder. I spent that first night staring at the ceiling, calculating the weight of the silence, wondering how a man who built bridges for a living could let the only one that mattered collapse so completely. I learned quickly that grief is a structural flaw you can't simply patch over. For 5 years, I lived like a ghost in my own life, turning my existence into a series of rigid calculations. I traded my home for a minimalist apartment that overlooked the industrial district, a place where the only sounds were the distant clanging of metal and the rhythmic hum of the city. I threw myself into work, taking on the most complex projects I could find. If I was calculating the tension of a suspension bridge at 2 in the morning, I didn't have to calculate how old Noah and Liam would be on their next birthday. My drafting table became my altar. I surrounded myself with blueprints, the sharp, blue lines providing a sense of order that my heart lacked. I became the man who never left the office, the engineer who could find a decimal point error in a 1,000-page report but couldn't look at a playground without feeling a physical ache in my chest. Every time I saw a pair of young boys in the park, I'd turn my head, focusing instead on the architectural integrity of the nearest building. I told myself I was moving on. I told myself that the DNA results were a final verdict, a physical law I couldn't break. But every night, before the exhaustion finally pulled me under, I'd see them, the way Noah used to tilt his head when he was thinking, and the fierce, protective way Liam would hold his brother's hand. Then came that Monday in November. The air in my office was stale, heavy with the scent of ozone from the plotter and the dregs of a fourth cup of coffee. I was lost in the stress distribution charts for the Riverside project, my eyes burning from the glow of the monitor. The silence of the building was absolute, a vacuum that felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. Then, at exactly 3:14 a.m., the vacuum shattered. My phone didn't just ring, it screamed against the mahogany surface of my desk. The vibration sent a stack of calipers rattling to the floor. I stared at the screen. Restricted ID. My first instinct was to ignore it, probably a telemarketer or a wrong number from a late-night site. But something in the rhythm of the buzz felt urgent, almost frantic. I picked it up on the fourth ring, my voice gravelly from hours of silence. Ethan Caldwell. Ethan? It's Vanessa. The name hit me like a physical blow, a sudden collapse of all the internal bracing I'd built over half a decade. Her voice wasn't sharp or metallic anymore. It was thin, frayed, and sounding more human than I had ever heard it. Vanessa? What is this? Why are you calling me? It's Noah, she choked out, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a hospital monitor beeping in the background. He's failing, Ethan. The doctors, they say he doesn't have much time. Please. You're the only hope we have left. The hospital floor smelled of industrial wax and filtered air, a sterile, suffocating scent that brought back every memory of the twins' birth. I walked toward the pediatric intensive care unit, my boots echoing with a heavy, rhythmic thud that felt like a countdown. My heart was a mess of structural failures, held together only by the desperate need to see my son. I saw Vanessa before she saw me. She was sitting in a plastic chair outside Noah's room, draped in a soft cashmere shawl, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. To the passing nurses, she was the picture of maternal grace, a tragic figure in a high-end tragedy. She was performing for the staff, her voice a fragile trill as she thanked a doctor for a cup of lukewarm water. But when her gaze shifted and caught mine, the mask didn't slip, it tightened. Ethan, she said, standing up. She didn't reach for my hand. She didn't offer a word of thanks. She looked at me as if I were a necessary but unpleasant guest at her private gala. You took your time. I drove 3 hours in 2, I replied, my voice sounding like gravel under a heavy load. Where is he? Before she could answer, the door to the room swung open. A boy stepped out. He was tall, his shoulders squared in a way that mirrored my own, but his face was a map of resentment. This was Liam. At 13, the soft edges of childhood had been replaced by the sharp, jagged lines of a teenager who had been taught to hate. He looked at me, and I saw a reflection of the fire I used to have, but it was directed entirely at me. What is he doing here? Liam's voice cracked, but the venom in it was steady. He stepped in front of the door, physically barring my way. Mom said you didn't want us. She said you signed the papers because we weren't worth the trouble. The lie was so heavy I could almost see it hanging in the air between us. I looked at Vanessa, expecting a flicker of shame, but she merely sighed, the long-suffering mother caught in the middle. Liam, honey, don't, she whispered, resting a hand on his shoulder. He's here for Noah. That's all that matters now. He's not here for Noah, Liam spat, his eyes never leaving mine. He's a stranger. He's been a stranger for 5 years. We don't need his blood and we don't need him. I stood there, a structural engineer who knew how to fix a crumbling skyscraper but had no tools for this. My own son was looking at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, fueled by half a decade of poison. Beyond him, through the glass partition, I could see Noah, pale, fragile, and hooked to a forest of plastic tubing. He looked like a bird with broken wings. "I'm not here for you, Liam," I said softly, the words catching in my throat. "And I'm not here for your mother. I'm here for my son." "You don't have a son," Liam countered, his voice a low, jagged blade. "You just have a match." The sliding glass doors of the testing wing felt like the entrance to a high-pressure chamber. Dr. Julian Mercer met me there, his lab coat a stark, clinical white against the dim hospital lighting. He was a man of precise movements, his eyes scanning my face with the detached curiosity of a scientist looking at a complex blueprint. He didn't offer a handshake, he simply gestured toward the drawing chair. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice as level as a horizon line. "We're running a full HLA typing and a high-resolution crossmatch. Given the urgency of Noah's marrow failure, we don't have the luxury of a slow turnaround." As he prepped the needle, the door hissed open. Vanessa stepped in, her heels clicking like a metronome on the linoleum. The devoted mother mask was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a sharp, restless energy. She stood by the cabinets, her arms folded tight across her chest, watching Mercer's every move. "Is this really necessary, doctor?" she asked, her voice light but edged with steel. "We already have the private results from years ago. He isn't the father. The chances of a random stranger being a match are astronomical. You're wasting time that Noah doesn't have." I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the vial as it began to fill with deep, crimson life. I felt the steady pulse in my arm, the same pulse I had felt in the tiny wrists of my sons when they were infants. "The protocol requires us to test all available family and history-linked donors, Mrs. Caldwell," Mercer replied without looking up. "Science doesn't rely on history. It relies on the present sample." "He's not family," Vanessa snapped, her patience finally snapping. She turned her gaze on me, her eyes flashing with a desperate sort of triumph. "Ethan, why are you doing this? To play the hero? To humiliate me? You know what those papers said. You know you're just a ghost in this room. Just leave. Let the hospital find a real donor instead of clinging to a fantasy." I waited until Mercer had capped the last vial before I spoke. I stood up, the slight lightheadedness of the blood draw grounding me rather than shaking me. "I'm not here for a fantasy, Vanessa. I'm here because if there is even a decimal point of a chance that I can save him, I'm taking it. I've spent 5 years following your rules. Today, I'm following the doctor's." The silence that followed was thick, a structural tension that felt like it was moments away from a total collapse. Vanessa looked at Mercer, then back at me, her face pale and tight. She seemed so certain, so anchored in the lies she had sold the world. "Fine," she whispered, her voice trembling with a cold, suppressed rage. "Sit in the waiting room. Waste your day. But when the results come back negative, don't expect me to let you say goodbye." She turned and swept out, leaving me alone with the hum of the refrigeration units and the weight of the unknown. I walked back to the plastic chairs of the waiting area, a man accustomed to measuring the strength of steel, now waiting for a lab to measure the strength of my own blood. The fluorescent lights in the consultation room hummed with a low-frequency vibration that I felt in my teeth. Dr. Mercer sat across from me, his hands resting on a manila folder with a grip so tight the cardboard was beginning to buckle. He wasn't the composed specialist I'd met an hour ago. His face was the color of parched bone, and his breathing was shallow, uneven, the way a man looks when he's standing on the edge of a structural collapse he didn't see coming. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, his voice barely a sandpaper rasp. He looked at the door, ensuring the lock was engaged, before leaning over the desk. "I've been a geneticist for 22 years. I deal in the absolute certainty of code. But what I am looking at, it defies every record your family has provided to this hospital." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Just tell me if I can save him. Is it a match?" "It's more than a match," Mercer whispered, pushing the printout toward me. His finger trembled as he pointed to the sequencing. "It's a perfect biological alignment. There is no doubt, Ethan. You are Noah's father. You are his 100% biological progenitor. The DNA tests your wife presented in court 5 years ago, they weren't just wrong. They were an impossibility. A cold wave of relief washed over me, followed immediately by a searing, jagged heat. The lie that had hollowed out my life for 5 years was finally being dismantled. I reached for the paper, my mind already calculating the legal repercussions, the way I would tear Vanessa's world apart for what she had stolen. But Mercer didn't let go of the folder. He pulled it back, his eyes searching mine with a look of profound, clinical horror. "That's not the anomaly, Ethan," he said, his voice dropping even lower, vibrating with a fear I didn't understand. "We cross-referenced your sample against the maternal baseline we took from Vanessa earlier today to confirm the transplant's success rate." He paused, and for a second, the entire hospital seemed to go silent. "Vanessa is not a match," he whispered. "And I don't mean she isn't a marrow match. I mean she is a biological stranger. There is zero genetic overlap between that woman and the twins. Ethan, your wife didn't just lie about you. She isn't their mother. Biologically, those children belong to you and a woman who isn't even in this building." The room tilted. Every pillar of reality I had leaned on for 13 years gave way at once. I was the father, but the woman I had built a life with, the woman who had claimed the twins as her own flesh and blood, was an intruder. I thought of the blueprints I'd spent my life drawing. Every line matters, every connection is vital. And in that moment, I realized the foundation of my entire family had been built on a void. "Then who?" I choked out, the air leaving my lungs. "If she didn't give birth to them, whose children am I raising?" Mercer didn't answer. He just looked at the charts, his silence the loudest sound I had ever heard. I sat in the hospital's darkened cafeteria, my laptop screen casting a cold, blue glow over a landscape of digital archives. To an engineer, a lie is just a poorly designed structure. If you look closely enough at the joints, you'll find where the stress caused the first crack. I didn't look for emotions, I looked for data. I bypassed the encrypted firewalls of the Caldwell joint accounts I hadn't touched in years, tracing a breadcrumb trail of medical consultations Vanessa had coded as routine wellness checks back in 2012. The crack appeared in a series of wire transfers to a boutique fertility clinic in a neighboring state, a facility that specialized in high-discretion donor services. I felt the familiar mechanical focus take over, my mind mapping out the timeline with the precision of a load-bearing calculation. Vanessa had always claimed the twins were a miracle after our struggle to conceive, but the ledger told a different story. She hadn't been seeking treatment for herself. She had been paying for storage fees. My breath hitched as I pulled up a subfile labeled Embryo Transfer, Protocol Alpha. The date was exactly 9 months before the twins were born. But the donor ID wasn't anonymous. It was linked to a private storage contract from a decade prior, a contract signed by Sarah. Sarah, my first love. The woman I thought had simply walked away from me because she had found someone else. A narrative Vanessa had carefully fed me during my lowest moments. Sarah, who had passed away in a car accident 3 years after our breakup. The realization hit me with the force of a structural collapse. Vanessa hadn't just used a surrogate. She had tracked down the embryos Sarah and I had frozen during her early battle with a different illness, years before Vanessa and I even met. Sarah had wanted to ensure we could have a family if she survived. When she left me, driven away by what I now realized were Vanessa's calculated lies, Vanessa had stepped in to comfort me, all while keeping those frozen lives as her ultimate insurance policy. She hadn't just stolen 5 years of my fatherhood. She had stolen Sarah's children. She had harvested a dead woman's legacy to secure her place in my estate, turning my grief into a tool for her own architecture of control. I looked at the screen, at the digital signature Vanessa had forged to authorize the implantation. She hadn't just lied about my paternity to hurt me, she had committed a biological heist. The twins weren't just my sons. They were Sarah's. And the woman upstairs, currently playing the role of the grieving mother, was nothing more than a thief who had moved into a house built on another woman's bones. I closed the laptop. The engineering phase was over. Now, it was time for the demolition. I found Liam in the hospital's outdoor terrace, a concrete slab suspended over the city lights. He was leaning against the railing, his shoulders hunched against the biting November wind. When he heard my footsteps, he didn't turn around. He just stiffened, his entire posture a defensive wall he'd been building for 5 years. "I told you to stay away from us," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "My mom's in there crying because of you. Why can't you just leave us alone?" I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I walked to the railing and laid the tablet on the cold metal between us. The screen was illuminated with the genetic compatibility charts, the raw, undeniable data of our shared blood. "I'm an engineer, Liam," I said quietly. "I don't believe in stories or he said, she said. I believe in what can be measured. Look at the markers. Look at the 99.9% probability." Liam glanced down, his lip curling in a sneer that looked exactly like mine used to. "I've seen those before. They say you aren't my father. Mom showed me the court papers. You walked away, Ethan. You chose your projects over your sons." "Look closer," I whispered. "Look at the timestamp on those results. They were printed 20 minutes ago. Dr. Mercer ran them himself." I watched his eyes track the lines of code. I saw the moment his breathing hitched, the moment the analytical part of his brain, the part he inherited from me, realized the math didn't add up with the story he'd been told. His hands began to shake as he scrolled through the report. This says you're a match," he stammered, his bravado finally cracking. "But she said the tests were final. She said you didn't even fight for us." "I fought until the law told me I had no right to," I said, stepping closer. "She didn't just lie to me, Liam. She lied to you. She used a fake test to steal 5 years of our lives. She wanted me to be a stranger because a stranger can't protect you from a woman like her." I saw the walls Vanessa had meticulously constructed around him begin to crumble. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow, painful disintegration. Liam looked at the tablet, then up at me, his eyes searching for the monster his mother had described. Instead, he found a man who looked exactly like him, holding out a hand to catch him as his world fell apart. "She told me you hated us," he choked out, the first tear tracking through the soot and exhaustion on his face. "She said we were a mistake you wanted to erase." "You were never a mistake," I said, my voice thick with the weight of 5 years of unspoken love. "You and Noah are the only things I ever built that mattered. And I am not going anywhere." Liam didn't say anything. He just leaned into me, his forehead hitting my chest, his sobs breaking the silence of the terrace. I held him, feeling the structural integrity of our bond snap back into place. Vanessa had built her empire on a lie, but she had forgotten one thing. You can't build a permanent structure on a foundation of sand. The sterile light of the consultation room felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. Vanessa sat across from me, her legs crossed, her eyes narrowed with a predatory impatience. She had retreated back into her role as the gatekeeper, convinced that my presence was merely a desperate attempt to reconcile. She didn't know that I had already mapped the structural failures of her life. "Noah is being prepped," she said, her voice clipped and cold. "Stop stalling, Ethan. If you're going to do this, do it. Or are you waiting for me to thank you? Because we both know you're only here to soothe your own guilty conscience." I laid a single sheet of paper on the table between us. It wasn't a standard hospital form. It was a comprehensive medical disclosure and affidavit, drafted with the help of a legal contact I'd called from the terrace. To an observer, it looked like a routine consent form for the transplant. To Vanessa, it looked like a white flag. "I'll do the transplant," I said, my voice as steady as a plumb line. "But I'm not doing it as a stranger anymore. I want full disclosure of the twins' prenatal history. You sign this, acknowledging the specific fertility clinic and the genetic origins of the embryos, or I walk. If I'm giving my marrow, I'm doing it with the full picture." Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Is this your grandstand? You want to play doctor now? Fine. If it gets you into that surgery suite, I'll sign your little vanity project. It doesn't change the fact that they're my sons, Ethan. A piece of paper won't make you their father in the eyes of the law." She grabbed a pen, her signature a jagged, arrogant scrawl across the bottom of the page. She didn't bother to read the fine print, the clauses that specifically referenced the stolen embryos from 2012 and the unauthorized use of Sarah's genetic material. She saw a man who had finally been broken, a provider who was once again falling in line under her terms. She thought she was winning because she was getting what she wanted, a healthy heir and a husband she could continue to manipulate. I picked up the paper, the ink still wet. In that moment, the weight of 5 years of lies shifted. Vanessa had just handed me the key to her own prison. By signing that disclosure to authorize the medical procedure, she had officially linked herself to the fraud. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said, tucking the document into my jacket pocket. "You have no idea how much this helps." "Don't get sentimental," she snapped, standing up to lead the way back to the ward. "Just save my son." I followed her, watching the back of her head, realizing that for the first time in 13 years, I wasn't the one being led. I was the one setting the charges. Noah was going to live, and the woman who had built her life on the wreckage of my past was about to find out what happens when you remove the load-bearing lie that holds it all together. The surgical prep area was a cathedral of brushed steel and humming monitors. Noah lay on the gurney, his eyes fluttering open as the sedation began to take hold. I reached out, my hand covering his small, pale one, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a father. "I've got you, Noah," I whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Vanessa stood by the door, checking her reflection in the glass, adjusting her shawl as if she were preparing for a press conference rather than her son's survival. She looked at her watch, her impatience radiating off her in cold waves. "Ethan, the surgeons are waiting. Let's get this over with so we can get back to our lives." "Our lives ended 5 years ago, Vanessa," I said, my voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency that made her stop. "Today is about the truth." The heavy double doors of the ward hissed open, but it wasn't the surgical team. 2 uniformed officers and a detective in a charcoal suit stepped into the sterile light. Dr. Mercer followed behind them, holding the file I had helped him build, the bridge between the genetic impossibility and the paper trail of her theft. Vanessa's face didn't crumble immediately, she simply shifted into her defensive posture, her eyes darting toward the exits. "What is this?" "This is a private medical wing. You can't be here." "Mrs. Caldwell," the detective said, his voice as clinical as the room. "We're here regarding a report of medical fraud, identity theft, and the unauthorized procurement of genetic material. We have a signed disclosure from you, dated 20 minutes ago, acknowledging the use of Sarah Thorne's embryos." The name Sarah Thorne hit her like a structural failure. The devoted mother mask finally cracked, the porcelain of her persona spiderwebbing into 1,000 jagged pieces. She looked at the paper in the detective's hand, the medical disclosure she had signed without reading, the trap I had laid with the cold precision of an engineer. That's a lie," she hissed, her voice rising into a shrill, desperate register. "Ethan, tell them. I did this for us. I did this to give you the family you wanted." "You didn't do it for me," I said, stepping away from the gurney as the orderlies began to wheel Noah toward the operating theater. "You did it because you couldn't stand the idea of me loving something you didn't own. You stole Sarah's children, and then you tried to erase the only part of her I had left." Liam stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, his face tear-streaked but his gaze steady. He didn't look at his mother with love or even anger anymore. He looked at her with the same detached observation I used for a building that was no longer safe to inhabit. "You told me he didn't want us," Liam said, his voice trembling but clear. "But he's the only one here who's actually telling the truth." As the officers moved in to lead Vanessa away, she didn't cry for her children. She screamed about her rights, about her lawyers, about the life she had built. I watched her go, a woman who had tried to build a skyscraper on a foundation of stolen bones, finally realizing that the weight of the truth is the one load you can never calculate away. The recovery room was quiet, bathed in the soft, amber glow of the late afternoon sun. The rhythmic hum of the heart monitor was no longer a sound of dread, but a steady, reassuring pulse, the sound of a structure that had held. Noah's color had returned, a faint pink flushing his cheeks as my marrow began its silent, vital work of rebuilding his life from the inside out. Liam sat in the chair next to the bed, his head resting on the mattress, finally asleep. He had refused to leave his brother's side since the surgery, but for the first time in years, the tension had drained from his shoulders. He didn't look like a soldier in his mother's war anymore. He looked like a boy who finally knew where he belonged. I stood by the window, watching the city skyline I had helped design. For years, I had defined myself by the things I built out of steel and glass, believing that if the math was right, the structure would stand. I was wrong. You can't build a life on calculations alone. You build it on the truth, even when that truth is painful, even when the foundations are laid in the shadow of a loss as deep as Sarah's. Vanessa's trial had been swift. The paper trail I'd uncovered, the stolen embryos, the forged signatures, the years of psychological manipulation, was a structural failure so absolute that even her expensive lawyers couldn't patch it. She was gone, locked away in a cell that was far smaller than the prison of lies she had trapped me in for a decade. She had tried to steal Sarah's legacy, but in the end, she had only ensured that Sarah's spirit would live on through the two boys who carried her eyes and my heart. A small stir from the bed caught my attention. Noah's eyes fluttered open, squinting against the sunlight. He looked at Liam, then his gaze drifted to me. He didn't look at me with the confusion of a stranger or the suspicion of a victim. He reached out a frail hand, and when I took it, his grip was surprisingly firm. "Dad?" he whispered, the words soft but anchored in a way I hadn't heard before. "I'm here, Noah," I said, my voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming sense of completion. "I'm right here." I looked at my sons, the bridge between my past with Sarah and the future I finally deserved to see. I wasn't just a provider or a biological mash. I wasn't an engineer staring at a broken blueprint. For the first time in 13 years, the weight on my chest was gone, replaced by the solid, unshakable reality of a family built on a true foundation. I wasn't just pretending anymore. I was a father. I've spent my entire career as a structural engineer calculating the load-bearing capacity of steel and concrete. I thought if the blueprints were perfect, the building would stand. But as you saw in my story, the most dangerous cracks aren't the ones in the walls, they're the ones in the people we trust. If there's one thing I've learned from the wreckage of my past, it's that a foundation built on a lie will eventually collapse, no matter how high you build it. Vanessa thought she could engineer a family through theft and gaslighting. She thought that by taking away my rights, she could take away my truth. But math and blood don't lie. I survived the last 5 years because I refused to stop looking for the structural flaw in her story. I want you to remember that when life feels like it's falling apart, sometimes that's just the demolition phase. It's making room for a foundation that's actually solid. Don't let anyone tell you who you are or what you're worth based on a piece of paper or a calculated whisper. If I had listened to those fake results 5 years ago, I wouldn't be sitting here today with my sons. If you believe that the truth is the only thing worth building a life on, then you're in the right place. We're building a community here of people who value justice and the strength of the human spirit. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Join our family. I've got many more stories to share with you, stories of resilience, of uncovering the shadows, and of the moments where the truth finally breaks through. I'm Ethan Caldwell, and I'll see you in the next chapter.